My name is Irene Walsh from Trinity College Dublin, and my co-editor-in-chief is Dr. Julie Regan, who's also on the screen there and also in Trinity College Dublin. And we are delighted to welcome Dr. Mary Pat O'Malley from the west coast of Ireland. So we're reaching you from the west coast and from the east coast simultaneously today, across the Emerald Isle this morning or this afternoon or this evening, wherever your time zone is. So you're very, very welcome. The format for today is just briefly, I'm going to outline a little bit about the journal to kickstart, to give you that background. And then I'm going to introduce Dr. O'Malley to you all. And we're in for a treat, I think, this morning. So it's a great way to celebrate Midsummer's Day. So just to give you a little bit background to the journal, I suppose the journal was conceived in January 2020, pre-pandemic, and that's kind of a long time ago now, it feels. So we're coming up to our almost fourth anniversary. And so far, we have been able to publish 3 volumes, and within that, almost 6 issues, with the 6th issue currently online and freely available. So we'd encourage you very strongly to go visit our website, because there's lots of information and papers are freely available online for a limited period. So it's worth your while having a look. And we have a great variety of topics within that. And also to say, it's the official journal of the Irish Association of Speech and Language Therapists. And we're very proud of that fact. And also, I suppose, to honour the past of the journal, we have the back issues from 1991 also uploaded onto the website. So we have that historical archive as well. And we're very grateful to iOS Press in particular, and of course to ISLT for their support in getting all of that information out there. We also have newsletters, and you can sign up to subscribe to a newsletter and to keep up to date with what's happening. So I'm going to say a couple of thank yous now, because invariably I forget at the end. So I'm going to thank in advance iOS Press for their support for today and for the journal in general. I'm also going to thank ISLT for always being there and helping us to, I suppose, put this message out there and share research with the community, both nationally and internationally. And also I especially want to thank Chris from TRIS, who's the Trinity Research Institute for Social Sciences, who has helped us in these webinars, the past 2 and in this one today. So thank you very much, Chris, because I'm really afraid I'd forget to thank you at the end. So thank you very much. So not to take up much more time, I want to introduce you, I'm really delighted to introduce you to Dr. Mary Pat O'Malley, who is an alumnus of Trinity, I have to say that, one of our own, but is now, as I say, on the west coast of Ireland, and she's a lecturer in speech and language therapy at the University of Galway. And she's not only that, but she's also program director of the BSc in speech and language therapy and co-director of the MSc in childhood speech language communication needs. They're just 2 feathers to her bow, and there are many, many others, I know, and Mary Pat might refer to those throughout her talk. It's very exciting that Mary Pat has just published a book tantalizingly entitled Multilingual Children, How to Develop All the Languages They Need and What to Do When You're Worried. And this book is primarily for parents and professionals, and I think is going down very well in that forum. And also a forthcoming book co-edited with her colleague Claire Carroll, entitled Assessment Case Studies of Multilingual Children, an Evidence-Based Approach. And again, Mary Pat might refer to that in her talk. So I'm not going to take any more of their precious time, Mary Pat. I'm just delighted to welcome you. Warm welcome, and over to you.
Thanks a million, Irene. I'll just share my screen now and we'll cross our fingers because it was fine beforehand. So you can see the presentation okay?
Yes, and just to mention before you start, any questions can be put into the Q&A, and I think Mary Pat is happy to take them at the end. We probably will try and go till about 1:45 or 1:50 our time.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks a million, Irene. And just before I begin, just to say again, thank you to Advances in Communication and Swallowing and Irene and Julie for inviting me to present on one of my favorite topics. And I'm delighted to be here today. I did a few weeks ago, I did 3 days of first aid responder training, and I realized that I love practical kind of skills. So the presentation has a strong evidence base, but I also have a lot of kind of practical resources that hopefully speech and language therapists will find useful for dealing with multilingual children in particular. Although some of the points I'll make kind of cross both children and adults in terms of clientele. So the title of the presentation is Myths and Misunderstandings, Recalibrating the Multilingual Mindset for SLTs. And the first thing I'm going to start to discuss, if this will move forward for me, oops, there we go, sorry, is the idea of terminology and the names we use to describe people who speak 2 or more languages. So there are lots of different words, and some of them are used interchangeably across the literature. So we have multilingual, bilingual, trilingual, polyglot, and then we have a lot of ones that have English in the title. So like English language learner, English as an additional language, dual language learner, or English as second language learner. And we're familiar with the quote about a rose by any other name would smell as sweet, but I'm not sure I agree, because if we look at these terms, for example, Prismus and Alvarado suggests rather than like English language learner or English as an additional language learner, we consider the term emergent bilingual youth. And the idea being behind this phrase is that children are actively participating in the acquisition of all of their languages. Whereas if learner is in the title, it suggests they are somehow teacher dependent. And obviously, you know, adults have a role in developing children's language, but that they are primarily actively engaged in the process of acquiring their languages. So emergent bilingual from Prismus and Alvarado's point of view moves away from a kind of a teacher dependency, and it also puts bilingualism at the center when we're talking about multilingual or bilingual people and making decisions together with them. They also take an asset-based approach, seeing multilingualism or bilingualism as advantageous, and the RCSLT also adopts that stance, and they take the stance of language as a resource orientation. So here, in terms of like recalibrating the multilingual mindset, this is an invitation to consider the terminology that we use and could we use something different. So emergent bilingual youth is one. McLeod et al. Then, excuse me, in 2016, and I like this as well, prefer the term multilingual over bilingual because it corresponds with the term multicultural. And that's important because language and culture are inextricably interwoven, and sometimes we can kind of divorce them from each other. And I have more to say about this later, but multilingual kind of suggests multicultural, and that's really important because it recognizes the multiplicity of linguistic influences in children's and adults' lives, and we can't divorce one from the other. In some of the literature, bilingual is used to cover people who speak 2 or more languages. My preference here is for the term multilingual. And then we come to the question, well, what does it mean to be multilingual? And again, there are loads of definitions. So I've picked the ones that resonate most with me. I think eclectic could be one of my middle names. So the presentation will have that kind of feel where I've picked the things that resonate with me and my values. So according to McLeod et al. In 2016, multilingual means people who are able to understand and produce 2 or more languages in oral, manual, or written form with at least a basic level of functional proficiency or use, regardless of the age at which the languages are learned. So often in the literature in relation to multilingual children, there's an emphasis on the age at which they started acquiring their languages. It's not always easy to work that out. It's not always clear. There can be an element of a focus too on proficiency, and I'm going to come back to that in a second as well. It's not necessarily particularly useful, but it's interesting that they have a basic level of functional proficiency included here, and regardless of the age. The manual element is important as well, because this then will cover people who are oral speakers and use sign as well. Sorry, just thought of something else to go back to the emergent bilingual youth and terminology. The other problem with terms such as English as a second language learner and English as a English language learner, privileges English as the additional language, and that's not the case for lots of people. And also, it's not necessarily their additional language, as in, or their second language. It could actually be their third or fourth, depending on the child's context. So that's something to bear in mind as well. So another option then from Cohenhart et al. 2021, and they use the idea of need to define who is multilingual. So individuals who need two different languages to succeed in their environments. Now, they use the term bilingual, but I really like the idea here of need. And they also talk about past, present, and future need. And they have adopted an intentionally broad and inclusive definition, emphasizing the language environment in which people live. And this is really interesting because we know it is practiced globally, unfortunately, across a range of professions to advise parents to drop a language. Multilingual children who have speech, language, and communication needs, and often the language that they are advised to drop is the home language, which tends not to be the language of the professional. And I advocate for parents to adopt this kind of need definition as well, because if you say to a professional, well, my child needs 3 or 4 languages to participate in all aspects of their lives, it's very difficult for the professional then to say, well, you have to drop one of them. I also like Cohenhart's approach of past, present, and future need, and that helps inform speech and language therapy assessment and intervention practices. Because for past needs, we need to think about in assessment the different languages the child uses, has used in the past, who have they used them with, what do they need in the present in terms of languages, and then what do we need in the future. And when I come on to talk about intervention, Cohenhart et al. Remind us that we have a responsibility to not only look at present needs, but to plan for future language needs of the child as well. Another concept then to think about is this idea of necessity or choice. So to go back to the, advising people to drop one language or drop a language, that is predicated on the notion that actually the person made a choice to be multilingual or bilingual. And 2 things I'd like to kind of say here in relation to choice is that for many people, it isn't a choice. It's just a matter of fact of society they live in. So if they live in, for example, India or South Africa, or lots of different countries where the norm is to be multilingual, they don't choose to be multilingual. And then globally, actually, there are more multilingual people than there are monolingual people. So it's not always a choice. It's just a necessity. So we have to bear that in mind. So if it's a matter of necessity because you have fled war or persecution and moved to a different country, then you haven't chosen this. It's a need. And our responsibility is to actually facilitate speech, language, and communication across the lifespan in relation to what our clients' communication needs are. If, on the other hand, it is a choice, so a family have decided they want to add an additional language, then if they do have speech, language, and communication needs, it's our responsibility to support that as well. So moving on then to the next kind of concept or idea to think about is this idea of comparison. And this is a proverb quoted by a friend of mine: comparison is the thief of joy. And what I mean here is that there is a strong tendency in the research at the moment, and for a long time, to compare monolingual children and bilingual children, and to use monolingualism as the benchmark against which we judge the speech and language abilities of multilingual children. And this is not a fair comparison. So there's a very interesting paper freely available from what I can remember by Anik Dahauer from last year. And her point is that basically it's not equitable to compare bilingual or multilingual children's language development to that of monolingual children. So that's why I have the apple and the orange there. So there is fruit as the overarching category, and then apples and oranges are different. Similar category, but they're different. So monolingual children are learning their language in all modes, so listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and they have one language. So the trajectory is expected to start from, say, after birth, and then gradually develop and become increasingly more complex as time goes on. Whereas for multilingual children, they're on the same path in terms of language acquisition, but they are doing it for 2 or 3 different languages, or 4 or more. And those languages are used for different purposes. They begin being exposed to them at different times. They show like preference for different languages at different stages. So their preference may wax and wane. Their performance on language testing will vary over task and time. And heterogeneity is a key characteristic of multilingual children. So it's very difficult to actually have any sense of kind of, oh, there are norms that apply. I think that's kind of refreshing in a way, because we say standardized testing only ever give us a snapshot of somebody's performance at one moment in time. Are they that meaningful? And certainly for the multilingual children, it's advised not to use standardized tests. And it's not just to do with the fact that the norms aren't culturally appropriate. It's often that the test items themselves and the testing situation itself may not actually be a good fit for what children are used to. So for example, if we're doing, let's say, the BPVS, and we're, you know, telling, or rather, no, sorry, that's not the example I mean. I'm thinking of the word expressive vocabulary part of one of the SELFs, where children are asked to name pictures, and we expect you say, what's this? And that the child will name the picture as in, let's say, apple or orange. But in some cultures, it's appropriate for the child to describe the function of the object. So there's a mismatch there between the test design and the individual child who's partaking of the test. So Anita Howard says then basically, and I think this is actually really sobering and important to think about, that this monolingual bias in many societies threatens the well-being of bilingual children and their families. And Betty, you in the States have some very interesting papers about families that are multilingual and have autistic children, where the advice has been to drop a language and the impact that has on family dynamics and the interaction in the family. In Dahawa's paper, she says that these comparisons are not equitable, as I've said, and she makes the case we actually don't need those comparisons to learn more about bilingual use and bilingual processing, that in actual fact, we need to look more at the different languages that the children are using, what do they need for their day-to-day communication, and what are the factors that support their learning and use, and that we can use then to inform those factors or those findings to inform, we say, speech and language therapy, for instance. So we need to stop using monolingual language development as the benchmark, because bilingual and multilingual children are not becoming monolingual speakers of each of their languages. And I'll return to that in a bit more detail later. Another concept that is worth reconsidering is this idea of balance. So because, and Conor Tadal, I'm going to have to show you the book actually, because I think it's excellent. It's Language Disorders in Bilingual Children and Adults. It's in its 3rd edition. So my presentation, as I said, is mainly about children, but this has great resources in relation to working with adults as well. And they talk about these 3 Ps that lead to the variation in multilingual children's language. And these are people, places, and purposes. So we need our different languages to interact with different people for different reasons and in different places. And that leads to, rather than this kind of straight line development, you get this kind of, you know, up and down, or as I said, variation across task and time. So for example, children might need Polish for home, and for grandparents who move to Ireland for, let's say, 6 months and are the primary caregivers. So they have all the language to do with relationships and home and all that vocabulary in Polish. And then they start school and they start acquiring English via their peers and also via the curriculum. So they start developing vocabulary for, let's say, subjects like science or maths or geography, which they may or may not have in the home language. And they use their languages for different purposes then. So the purpose of the home language might be to connect with extended family members. The purpose of the community language could be for education and to connect with English-speaking peers if you're living in Ireland, let's say, for example. So that's something to bear in mind as well. Another consideration is this idea of language rights and the human rights perspective. And DeLuca in 2018 had a very interesting paper about this kind of approach. And UNESCO in 2017, the quotation there says that local languages, especially minority and indigenous languages, transmit cultures, values, and traditional knowledge. So they play an important role in promoting sustainable futures. And there is that line, you know, if you can't see it, you can't be it. So one thing we could consider is, for example, the linguistic geography of the clinics that we work in. So is English the predominant language in terms of signage or, you know, visuals that people see when they come in? What is the evidence that their language is valued, for example? So she also talks about the importance, of ensuring that young people never succumb to the notion that their mother tongue is a debased language, and that we need to find practical ways of ensuring that home languages are considered important assets for future generations. And SLTs have a role in this in terms of advocating for supporting home languages and for focusing on them in assessment, and intervention. Another concept then that I was thinking about that is useful to consider, and this I think is quite a sobering thing to reflect on from De Houwer's paper, and this idea of do no harm from the Hippocratic Oath. And De Houwer says that language discrimination from SLTs can deeply affect socio-emotional well-being. And how does this happen? Now, it's not just SLTs, it happens across, you know, healthcare and education settings, but it does happen when we evaluate bilingual children's language performance only with reference to the monolingual norms, as I said, and that when we make far-reaching decisions regarding children's trajectories based on these norms. So it's, as I said, quite sobering to think about that, the negative impact of what we do by choosing to focus only on the community language, by ignoring or not focusing on the home language, or by, you know, advising families to drop a language. So what she says, and this is in relation to research, De Houwer says that a minimum ethical requirement in research is attention to all of a bilingual person's languages. And I think the same applies really in speech and language therapy practice, because the point she makes is, and this comes back to language and culture and the relationship and the importance of the home languages, that if she talks about the non-society language, which would be the home language. So if the child or young person doesn't have proficient use now of their home language, that communication between parents and children may be disrupted, thus negatively affecting parent-child relationships and parents' abilities to educate their children, and communication with grandparents and other important adults may become impossible. And we certainly don't want to be involved in the disruption of relationships or having negative consequences for communication, because by focusing really on only one of the multilingual child's languages, we're effectively cutting them off from all the skills that they have in the other language. And in Catherine Conrad's book, they use the left hand analogy. So if you're right-handed and that's your dominant hand, and your left hand is your non-dominant hand, and if you're advised to drop a language, it's like being told to not use your left hand at all. And then once you try, if you actually try to do that, you realize how much you use your non-dominant hand for, and it kind of underlies that it doesn't make sense actually to advise people to drop one of their languages. And then De Houwer takes it one step further in terms of linguistic discrimination and the serious implications of or consequences for adopting that approach. Other things just to remember is that speaking two or more languages doesn't cause speech or language difficulties, and it doesn't exacerbate them or make them worse. There's evidence to show that autistic people and people with Down syndrome can and do become multilingual. And again, we need to think as well about the definition. We're not talking fluent. We need to go back to those 3 Ps, the people, places, and purposes, and look at the amount of exposure, the quality of exposure, the opportunities to use the languages, and the individual motivation, which can wax and wane over time. Also, Conrad et al. Remind us that intervention for bilingual children with language disorders must explicitly support the development of both or all of the languages the child needs to be successful in the range of his or her communicative environment. And I have lots of ideas later on for how you might actually do this. It's also important to remember that, of course, there are systemic constraints and barriers to speech and language therapists' ability to actually enact best practice guidelines. So one of those is time, a significant one, because if the best practice guidelines state that we are to assess all of a child's languages, then we're going to need more time to do that. You're going to need to work with an interpreter. You're going to need at least double the time that you would for if you're assessing a child in English only, let's say, for example. So there needs to be change within the system around that as well. And the other barrier is resources. Now, yes and no, I've kind of mixed feelings about the resources thing, because there are actually lots of resources available as it stands to facilitate culturally responsive or culturally sensitive practice. And I've given you loads of them, so it would be a good beginning. or you may know some of them already, so it might be just a reminder. So moving on now to the practical solutions. Virgin, McLeod and Wong in 2015 looked at a range of different sites across the world in terms of working with multilingual families, and they coded their data according to these kind of 6 principles. And to me, this struck me as a very useful framework for considering your practice, because you think, okay, which of these am I actually including in my clinical practice, or which needs a bit of tweaking? So they are called the principles for culturally competent practice. And just a word about the phrase cultural competence, and I'm not going into it today, but there's also debate about that, because cultural competence suggests that you can become competent in another person's culture, which is not the case. And it also suggests that there's a final destination at which you arrive and suddenly you are culturally competent. But actually it's a journey, there is no final destination. So there were other terms like cultural humility. That's also problematic, because can you really say you're humble about something? And then there's culturally responsive or culturally sensitive or culturally aware, more kind of neutral terminology. So just going through each of these, I have resources under each one. So for devising culturally appropriate and mutually motivating goals, ethnographic interviewing is a place to start. And there is a fantastic paper by Westby, Burda and Mehta from 2003. Now I know it's dated, but the principles of ethnographic interviewing haven't changed significantly. It's available freely on the ASHA website, and they have like sample questions. So for example, things like, can you tell me about a day in your child's life? Or can you tell me about transition times? And it really gives you insight into what communication means for the family and what's important to the family. If you wanted to take that another step further, there's another fantastic approach that I really like called skilled dialogue. And there is a free PDF if you Google skilled dialogue, and the principles of it are there. And it's about reciprocity and respect and honoring the voice and seeing both participants in the situation as having equal contributions to make, and learning from each other. So then in terms of knowledge of languages and culture, again, some great resources out there. So Omniglot is an online encyclopedia with some kind of basic information about the different languages that you can look at before, would say, you start working with the family if you're not familiar with the syntax, would say, or the morphology of the language. There's the World Atlas of Language Structures online. I mentioned the Signs in the Clinic. Then I have a blog called Talk Nua. So I set that up, and there's loads of information there, different blog posts about different techniques for working with multilingual children, advice to give to parents, for example. Sorry, I'm glad I just got out there. And there's also a series of growing up with 2 or more languages leaflets in a range of languages, including Irish, English, Polish, Finnish, Russian, French, and Spanish, and they are free to download on the Talk Nua website. Then on YouTube, there's a fantastic endeavor called Multilinguals Live, and that is a series of interviews with various academics around different topics in working with multilingual children. So there's information about literacy in multilingual children. I've done one on speech, language, and communication needs in multilingual children. There is one about babies and babbling and kind of very early language development. So, and they're all freely available. The IELTS Multilingual and Multicultural Affairs Committee has a great set of resources for SLTs and for parents and educators, I think, as well. And then I have to give a shout out to the Peach website, because I'm an ambassador for this Erasmus Plus funded project, whose aim is to support the 24 minority languages of the EU. And there are some fantastic resources there for parents and for educators and SLTs. So there is a guide for parents on raising multilingual, they say bilingual children. There's one for educators. I have a chapter in the book on the guide for parents. There's also a database of activities in the 24 minority languages of the EU, and you can search the database according to age and the different kinds of activities, and you can also add in resources that you're aware of into the database. And there's also a series of 5 short videos on myths about raising multilingual children, which would be very useful for sharing with parents. And then finally, in relation to knowledge of languages and culture, there is Translat, which is a fantastic program, again, with vocabulary in a range of different languages for days of the week, colors, months of the year, so on and so forth. It's really good. Knowledge of languages and culture, then I've kind of mentioned this, so I'm just conscious of time, so I won't necessarily say everything that's on the slide, but that we need to consider, particularly in relation to young children, let's say, who may be slow to talk or late to talk, and the advice we give around, language enrichment and what's called language socialization. We need to think about, are those strategies a good fit for the culture of the individuals that we are working with? Because while language is ubiquitous in human cultures, talkativeness varies. Tolerance for silence varies. The role of the parent in the child's language development is also culturally specific. And there's large cross-cultural variation in the linguistic experiences provided to young children, yet globally, most children do develop speech and language without any difficulties. And the thing to bear in mind is that a lot, when we were training as SLTs, like a lot of the knowledge about language development and language socialization is based on research conducted in what weird societies. I love this term weird. So that refers to Western educated, industrialized, rich democracies. So there's bias in the research if we think of like norms, for example, in terms of styles of interaction. So in the weird societies, and I'll come on to this in a second, we tend to prize verbal prowess and the individual, but in other cultures, it's group harmony is what is valued, and the child being a good listener to a tale told by an older person, for example, rather than generating their own narrative. So we need to think about how social and material environments differ in terms of their family and household composition, the caregiver roles, so extended family like aunties and uncles and grandparents, the times and methods of food gathering and other essential needs and education practices. So another great resource there is Dollar Street, where it has photographs from families all over the world showing how different people live, what food costs or the different kinds of foods that they eat, how much money they need for basic living expenses. So it's really good for cultural awareness kind of development. So just a word on this in terms of, again, reflecting on this is what we do in the weird societies. Our beliefs are that adults treat children as conversational partners from birth. And I'm sure you can all recognize this, and we do this in our practices kind of as a matter of course. Adults talk to children directly and expect them to engage with adults in play and talk. Adults believe children learn by talking. Adults value individual accomplishments. They applaud displays of an individual child's verbal and other abilities. We highly value and encourage literacy skills and educational attainment or achievement. But for example, in some cultures, they believe that a child does not have sense until they're about age 5. So the language socialization practices are very much peer-based, not parent-driven. So again, these are things we need to bear in mind. And also, as parties Jean C. and Craig remind us that there should be no doubt that all language socialization patterns are successful within the societies and material environment in which they evolved. Another thing to consider is what our expectations around eye contact. So for some people, not establishing direct eye contact is a sign of respect for an older person. Whereas in the weird cultures, we tend to associate direct eye contact with the signal that you're interested. So something to think about. Number 3, then, in relation to the culturally appropriate resources, there are 2 papers that are available online. They have fantastic, really specific recommendations for how to make your intervention more culturally sensitive. And then the bilingual picture books are also great because they are designed with multiple languages in mind. Wordless picture books also another great option, and I'm a great fan of the local library, and the librarians are so helpful in terms of identifying maybe useful wordless picture books, or I'm sure people have their own kind of lists accumulated already. Then in terms of the next principle, the consideration of the cultural, social and political context. So there in September with the first year students, I did a little survey of the last movie and the last TV series and the last book that people had read for pleasure. And we looked at them all, and across 25 or 27 students, there was one TV series in a language other than English, and all of the books were based in Britain, America or Australia. So this is like a really interesting way into considering cultural, social and political context is through what you read and what you watch. And I'm curating a list at the moment actually of books that I've read and I love reading in terms of novels that really give you insight into different ways of being. And there are some really nice novels as well where it gives you insight into what it's like to move from one culture to another. So consultation with families and communities, again, aware of the time, I'm going to kind of skip through here, but Ball and Lewis wrote a very interesting paper, which is also available, looking at working with Indigenous communities and looking at kind of building capacity and linking more with the individuals in the community, rather than, let's say, expecting maybe people to come to the clinic, might be going to the community and looking at culturally congruent communication skills. And those two papers that I mentioned earlier will give you great ideas for how to do that. For collaboration between professionals, then the RCSLT have two great resources about working with interpreters, and there's the BID framework, so the briefing beforehand, the interaction, what happens in the session, and then the debriefing afterwards, again bearing in mind the time constraints that are already in the system. So in terms of assessment options, I've just put up a range of things there very briefly. Narrative, the multilingual assessment instrument for narrative, it's available in Irish. We've done an Irish adaptation here at the University of Galway. And it's available in 92 languages minimum. It keeps changing because there are lots of people working on it, and it's available for free. The intelligibility and context scale is available for free in a range of languages, including Irish. The communication development inventories, MacArthur Bates, available in a range of languages. And if you contact Dr. Ciara O'Toole in UCC, you can get the Irish version of it. And then there's an infant and toddler. PABIC is a parental questionnaire about language use and family history of speech and language difficulties. And there is an available version of that in Irish if you contact Ciara as well. The Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire, for example, is available in a range of languages. And MacLeod et al. Have an open access tutorial from 2017 all about assessing speech in multilingual children. And there's more resources in there and very clear kind of guidelines for what to do. Little bit of a self-promotion plug here. So as Irene very kindly said at the beginning, this is my book for parents and professionals of working with multilingual children or parenting multilingual children. And it covers all sorts of things like what are the influences on multilingual language development. And it's evidence-based but accessible. And along with the book, there are 14 PDFs where you can kind of chart your child's language development, and they might be a nice addition in terms of, you know, informal assessment and charting single words, two-word phrases, so on and so forth. So that is available on Amazon. And Claire, Carol, and myself are writing this at the moment, nearly finished, and hope to be published in early 2024. And in this book, we have basically the first half is all about the kind of background knowledge that you need. So about language development in different contexts, so bilingual from birth, or maybe acquiring another language in school, and current assessment practices. And then we have 12 actual cases where we are applying the information from the first half of the book and giving very practical suggestions for next steps in terms of assessment. And we use the ICFCY as the framework for conducting a holistic assessment of multilingual children. In terms of intervention then, I love this quote from Connor et al., where she says that monolingualism is not a cure for DLD in bilingual children, nor does it improve the communication disorders associated with autism, ID, or other conditions. And this is really important to bear in mind because, as I said earlier, if we only focus on one language, we're actually disadvantaging the child because we are cutting them off from the language skills that they have across their other languages. So she says that the available evidence suggests that dual language learners with language disorders are not more impaired than their monolingual peers with language disorders, all else being equal. And I really I've just put these in as well because I think it's so important that intervention success for bilinguals or multilinguals requires access to all of their languages, and discounting one of the child's languages limits his or her resources, negates previous communicative experiences, and denies him or her future opportunities. And again, we don't want that on our conscience. So I think, again, sobering reading. Home languages are really important because when they are well supported, children whose parents were immigrants report higher self-esteem, better relationships with family members, and greater academic aspirations than their cultural peers who spoke only English. A general consequence of loss of the home language has been found to be engaging in risky behaviours in adolescence. And when adolescents at least understand the home language, if not use it, they have been found to have a higher quality relationship with their parents. So again, really emphasising why it's important to support the home languages in intervention. Different options then are, for example, if you're doing parent training, that you group parents who speak the same language. So that would mean then that the SLT would be in the minority and the parents could kind of support and coach each other through their stronger language. Using peers as language models, there's some research done on that to support that as an idea. And Catherine Conner et al. Really emphasise activities that promote metalinguistic skills. So that's contrastive analysis where you might, for example, use Google Translate and then critique the translation and edit the grammar to make it more, it would say, natural sounding or correct grammar, grammatical errors, and have discussions about, oh, for example, in Irish, the verb comes first, but in English, it's the subject that comes first, or how do you do it in your language, and building activities around those, highlighting similarities and differences. Back and forth school and home books are an idea where the vocabulary might be in English in the clinic, we'll say, and then it's sent home and the parents add the words in their language if they can do that. And then there is a nice paper actually about migrant workers in the States where they just drew stick figure pictures of simple events with their children, like going to the supermarket, and then there was bilingual intervention weaving those drawings into the intervention and kind of building language on the basis of what the parents had submitted. This is the last slide then in terms of the intervention options, and I found this kind of consoling too, because you might be thinking, oh, what will I do? And it's so overwhelming. But in the corner book, they have this table with the 3 elements. So in intervention goals, we need to think about the professional's actions, who are their partners in the professional actions, and what are the target areas. It's kind of an A, B, C kind of framework. So it might be that you're advocating with the client to support the home languages, because parents might say, well, we're in Ireland now and people speak English, so they need English. And the role of the SLT there is to advocate for the home languages and for multilingualism and not excluding any language, for example. Or it might be that you are teaching or training siblings or aunties or cousins or grandparents in interactions for how to stimulate language development, for example. Or you might be looking at the intersection of languages, how they compare and how they're different. So that's just to give you an idea there. I have the references here then for you to consult with afterwards, and then just to say thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Mary Pat, for a fantastic overview. Certainly huge learning there. So really appreciate all the time you've taken to prepare this fantastic presentation. So we're going to invite webinar attendees to submit any questions that they might have through the Q&A that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. So we welcome any questions from those who are attending to come in. And while I keep an eye on that, we can see no questions yet. I have a very naive one for you, Mary Pat, while we're waiting for something to come in, because this certainly is not my area. So please refrain from laughter. But I'm interested, as someone who doesn't work in the area, when you say we need to move away from this idea of monolingual language development. Does that mean a lot of the long-standing standardized language assessments need to be updated in terms of the norms that they have?
It's an excellent question, Julie, right? And it's not an easy one to answer in that. So if we think of like standardized testing, that generally, so there are, for example, some tests they'll include a small pool of multilingual children in the norms when they're standardizing the test, but that's not good enough, because it would mean that, let's say, 95% of the sample are still monolingual English speakers, and that 5% group, there's like individual variation is a key characteristic of multilingual children. So we'd need to know what are the characteristics of the children in that sample, and it's still only like 5%. So the other problem then is with the standardized tests that are in English, you can't translate them, and we shouldn't translate them, because there isn't a natural, what am I trying to say, that concepts don't necessarily translate easily from one language to another. The syntax is different in one language to another, so you won't be testing what you think you're testing if you translate it. And like, if you're being very radical, right, really, we shouldn't be using the idea of norms with multilingual children. It's too difficult, because even within a very carefully matched group of multilingual children, you get a lot of individual variation that's considered typical, as well as between groups of multilingual children. And you know, what's true for the group isn't necessarily true for the individual. And like in that IELTS document about assessing multilingual children, like they're quite categorically saying we should not be using standardized tests and the scores from standardized tests for assessing multilingual children. They do say you can use like item analysis. So if you did do it in English, you could use the item analysis to see what did the child, where did they score correctly on, or where did they kind of exhibit difficulty. You'd have to take it in the context of their exposure to English. But also, like I said, there's the issue, are the items culturally sensitive, and is this testing situation culturally sensitive? So the alternatives that are recommended, one is like non-word repetition and sentence repetition. And in the book that Claire and myself are writing, we go into that in a lot more detail. But you can look at the BISLI or Beasley website for details of those tasks. You do have to do a bit of work because you have to approach people to get the tasks. They're not like freely available. And then dynamic assessment is another thing that's recommended, but it's very hard to implement because you'd have to put a lot of work into actually producing a dynamic assessment task that you can't like buy it off the shelf. But the multilingual assessment instrument for narratives is suitable from children aged 3 to 10. And that is designed with multilingual children in mind. So like that is a good place to start. I should also say, however, I am aware that if you're looking for funding for extra support for children, like the system probably requires standard scores, or, you know, so that is a problem. Do you know what I mean? In terms of the context, the reality of clinical practice.
So that process hasn't really caught up with the evidence base.
Precisely, yeah.
It's fascinating. Thank you, Mary Pat. Irene, did you have a question?
I do have a question, and there's a couple of other questions in the chat here, but I'll read out Una's. What happens when parents are not concerned and teachers are raising concerns about language development?
Excellent question. And to me, when I hear that, I think that's an opportunity for a conversation. Like, you know, and that kind of the ethnographic interviewing, the skilled dialogue in particular, I love the skilled dialogue. But again, with skilled dialogue, you have to do a lot of preparation to actually, you know, implement it in practice. And that is all about like exploring, like, what does the situation look like from the parents' point of view? And, you know, people have a right to not to choose not to engage in services. And also we need to think about, I think, for example, you know, the way if you offer something and people don't accept it or don't take it up, you have to go, well, is there something that I could tweak about what I'm offering? So is it that we go out into the community, or that rather we don't do home visits, because for some people it's intrusive to have the professional in the home, but it's logistically challenging to get to a clinic. So we need to just think about where are we going to conduct the session, all those kinds of things. But in that scenario, I would be just really curious to hear the parents' perspective very openly, you know, what's their perspective. And then all you can do, I think, in that case is listen to their perspective, share yours, and decide where you're going to go from there, and leave the door open.
Thanks, Mary Pat. There's another just comment here from Caroline. It comes under my name, but it's Caroline Jago here in Trinity. He's just mentioned how useful these principles are for the multilingual adult populations too. Just making that comment. And it is, yeah, I can see how that can apply so easily. A comment I want to make, and I also have a question. And thank you, Mary Pat. That was so thought-provoking. I've learned so much. And particularly, of course, what resonated with me was the duty we have around this area, and particularly, and you know where this is leading, to, you know, the child's mental health and well-being. That really struck me now. Something I hadn't given thought to before in this context of multilingualism.
Oh, I agree. It's quite sobering, as I said, isn't it? When you read it there in black and white, what Anita who are saying, you're going, oh my God, like, have we been involved in cultural destruction? Have we been involved in like trauma by neglect in a way of the cultural context and the cultural specificity of things? And there is another very good website actually called Harmonious Bilingualism that is, Anita Hauer is involved in that, and it looks a lot at the well-being of children, multilingual children. She talks as well about, and again, it's sobering for early childhood educators, of the trauma experienced by children when they enter into childcare where they do not speak the language of the childcare and there's no one there who speaks their language, and the impact on their emotional well-being of that experience where they are suddenly plunged into a situation where they are like, it's totally unfamiliar and there's nobody there who can speak their language.
Mm, mm. I have a question, but I see Mary-Therese is posing a question, so we'll let that one go first and then I can get back. Is having recently done some EAL work in schools, I was taken aback to discover that the guideline text is almost 20 years old. How do you see your discovery being brought into the educational sector, informing inputs there? Thank you. That's from Mary-Therese.
Okay, great. So with the educational text, do you mean like a text that was being used to develop English with the children? And assuming that it was, well, I have done several webinars with the English Second Language Teachers Association in Ireland, kind of disseminating similar information to here and looking at timeframes for multilingual language development. And I've also done seminars with the, I have to think of the name now, sorry, but with teachers across different regions in the country where, again, we've explored all of these. And I'm going to be doing a talk in UCC next year on a master's program, I think, for, again, working with teachers to do with English and coming from the speech and language therapy perspective. And I think, again, it's a matter of like sharing resources, having conversations, being open, and it's a slow burn, like it's going to take a long time. And, you know, like Ireland is multilingual for a long time. And like, it's just incredible that like we're even having this conversation in 2023. Like, I'm looking forward to the day where this will be irrelevant because it will already have happened. So I think that's it really, about just being open to having the conversations, and maybe it requires a degree of courage as well to kind of to speak up and go, no, that's not okay, actually. But again, it's all about how you do it. The skill dialogue, it comes back to that. I think it's, yeah, really useful.
Thanks, Mary Pat. If you're happy, we have one more question here in the chat, and thank you, everybody. It's lovely to see you interacting with Mary Pat here. Cy Prendeville is asking, just wondering your thoughts about working with multilingual families who have complex communication needs, for example, autistic non-speaking person.
Okay, great. Hi, Cy. Cy is one of our alumni. So great to see you here, Cy. And so it's right, a great question. And it's not my area, but I like, for example, again, it comes back to those principles of need. What does the person need to be able to communicate about? And in which of their languages, and those 3 Ps, the people, places, and purposes. I do think, and again, this is just a very generic comment, but if we're talking like AAC, then the device, if it's got a voice, if it has an output, it needs to be in the languages that the person needs. Again, not my area, but do you know what I'm saying in terms of it needs to be like culturally sensitive and culturally specific. And if we think about what the person needs to communicate about, in which of their languages, in what places, with what people, if that underpins your formulation of goals with families, then I think you're on the right track. So I'm sorry, I don't have anything very specific there. I do think Betty Yu is worth looking up in terms of her papers about the impact of having a monolingual focus in children who are autistic and multilingual, and the impact on the family.
Okay, we have a couple more minutes, so maybe can I squeeze in my question, Julie? That's okay.
Absolutely.
I was very interested in your comment, Mary Pat, about the linguistic geography of the clinic. I'm fascinated by that. You know, myself and Caroline a number of years ago looked at the linguistic geography of the psychiatric settings, signposting, etc., which was sobering. But I'm very interested in how would you go about informing that? How would you go about developing that? Because obviously you'd have to choose some languages over others. And how would you go about it?
Or would you? So would you do, again, like off the top of my head, would you do a survey? Like, you know, the most frequent languages that are being spoken by the people who are attending your service. So you could start there. I think it would be a really lovely collaborative project where you would, but again, we're talking time and resources here. So like where you would collaborate with families who are coming in And because it really is an opportunity for the SLT to step out of the expert role and position the families as the experts and like learn from them. So that's where I would begin. I would look at kind of what are the most commonly spoken languages that I'm seeing, you know, with families coming in. And I think a collaborative session with the families going, we really want to change our environment, and what would you like? What would make you feel welcome? Because some teachers would say, for example, you know, the way in some schools they'd have some, and there's another great website actually called the Language Friendly School, that where they'd have, you know, so many languages are spoken, X number of languages are spoken in our classroom. And then if there's only one child who speaks a language, if, you know, if it's fairly monocultural and there's only one child, often they don't want to be identified as, they don't want to stand out. So, you know, there's a degree of sensitivity there. And then I think it would be a matter of like just finding the vocabulary, the pictures, and doing a collaborative project with people where you decide, is it the welcome? Like we looked at the on-site clinic here at the university, and it was all imperatives and it was all negative. No walking, no food or drinking, no running, or no, not no walking, sorry, no running. And then, so it's been changed now and it's much more, it's at eye level. So with the children, when they come in the door, they see, you know, photographs and pictures, you know, at their eye level. Now we've a bit to go with the cultural piece and the multilingual piece, but that's kind of how I would envisage that being developed.
And incorporating, as you say, issues like talkativeness or not, eye contact or not, you know, it's all very, very interesting. Thank you, Mary Pat. I think there's a comment there. Is there, Julie?
There is, yes. Danny is asking if you wouldn't mind repeating the name of the ASD paper that you mentioned.
Oh yeah, no problem. So the author is Betty Yu, and she has a couple. If you just put into Google Scholar, Betty Yu and autism and bilingual, I'd say you should get them. And if not, just drop me a line. It's marypat.o'malley@universityofgalway.ie, and I'm happy to send them on to anyone.
Right. Mary Pat, is there anything you want to add? I mean, that's been a fantastic session and we're doing really nicely on time. Is there anything you want to add, or are you?
No, I think that like I do appreciate, I don't want people to feel bad, do you know what I mean? Because I do appreciate that it is really challenging, and particularly the system is not supportive of SLTs, you know, following best practice guidelines. So there's a lot of work that needs to happen like internally in terms of, like I said, giving more time to assess multilingual children. And just to reassure people that there's loads of resources out there. And for example, there a few years ago, we were involved in a project, it's still ongoing, but it was looking at non-word repetition and sentence repetition tasks. And there was sentence repetition, I think, in Polish and Russian, and like the children were thrilled when they came in and they were doing an activity in their home language. Like they couldn't believe it. And if you could participate, if you could be part of that, like to make somebody feel very, welcome, and like, oh, it's valued, like my language is valued. And another thing actually, in that Virgin, Wong and McLeod paper, it was, they talk about like learning some words in the languages of the people that attend your clinic. So like where you show at least you have learned, you know, to say hello and goodbye, or I'm sure people are doing this already, but there was one therapist in their study who was able to operate professionally in about 10 languages. Now, I'm not saying, you know, that's a very high benchmark. And I did read, last point, I did read somewhere else, which I thought was very interesting. I can never remember where it was. So is that if you take a job in an area that has a high proportion of clients who are multilingual, you do have an ethical obligation to learn at least some of the language. Right. And it, like, that makes sense to me, because otherwise, you know, you're exacerbating kind of the power differential. And it's good for SLT, I think for us to be in the learner role and the be not sure. And that's why with the translation activities, they're really nice, because the child is the expert in the home language and they can kind of teach you and see that you're struggling and how you deal with something that is kind of difficult or that you can't get your head around. So, you know, I think that's really nice in terms of true collaboration.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Mary Pat. That was absolutely fantastic. And I think you've really blown apart a lot of the myths, and you've taken a very kind of holistic stance, which I think will give therapists confidence that they can approach it that way.
I hope so.
You've been very generous with the resources. There's a huge amount of material there for people to, to delve into. So that's greatly appreciated, I'm sure, by the audience. So a big thank you. The good news is, just before we came on air, I invited Mary Pat to contribute a Spotlight On article for the journal, and she's agreed. And you're all witnesses. So that will appear in the journal over the next while, probably summing up some of the main points that you've made today. But we really, really appreciated your practical knowledge, your expert knowledge, and your common sense knowledge, I think is greatly appreciated. So thank you very much. And is there anything else to add there, Julie, or am I?
I don't think so. Just to repeat it, thanks to Mary Pat and also to our journal community. Thank you so much for engaging and for logging on and asking questions. We want to provide webinars that are of interest to you. So please stay tuned. And if you have any suggestions for future webinars, or even any ideas for future articles, or if you want any support with submitting, please get in touch with the journal. And thanks so much again to Mary Pat.
Yes, thanks, Mary Pat. And thank you, Chris, also, and Julie. Bye-bye, everybody. Have a good day.
Bye.